November 8, 1942. That day something changed definitively in the way British soldiers viewed their new allies. There were no official statements or speeches to the press. What there was a silent observation. For the first time, American units were retreating after direct contact with German forces. It wasn't panic nor moral collapse. It was a retreat that was too rapid, made before the command structure had time to react. Among the British, no one laughed. Many of them had memories of France in 1940 that were too recent to feel entitled to judge. They recognized that movement because they had already lived through it. A British non-commissioned officer, a veteran of previous campaigns, recorded in his personal notebook a phrase that never passed censorship and was never intended to become history. They advance confident that initiative is enough. They retreat when they discover that war doesn't work that way. There was no contempt there. There was experience. For the British, the war had already made it clear that courage without coordination quickly exacts its price. They knew that enthusiasm doesn't replace doctrine, that willpower doesn't compensate for command failures, and that learning under fire is inevitable, but always costs lives. Seeing the Americans retreat, the dominant thought wasn't they are weak, but they haven't been through this before. A silent understanding formed. That army would learn, as all do. But first, it would make mistakes that the British had already paid dearly to understand. This type of judgment never appeared in textbooks or films. It survives only in personal notes, conversations between veterans, and memories that were almost lost. And that's precisely why it's worth bringing it to light. If this silent reading among allies helps you see the war more honestly, tell us in the comments what you think the British really felt at that moment. And stick around, because it's these forgotten stories that give meaning to continuing to tell this war as it was, not as it was portrayed. For British soldiers, the American retreat was not an emotional shock. It was a shock, intellectual. For months, even before the first serious confrontation, there was an almost automatic expectation. The Americans would arrive with numbers, with modern equipment, with confidence, and that would solve the problem. For those who had already lived through 1940, this idea sounded dangerously naive. Among British officers, there was a silent conviction. Technology helps, but it only works when it finds a method. What they observed in that first retreat was not a lack of courage, but a clear mismatch between expectation and reality. Many Americans advanced, believing that initiative and speed would suffice. For the British, this was nothing new. They themselves had already believed this, and buried enough men to never repeat the mistake. In conversations away from the hierarchy, the diagnosis was recurring. The Americans were still fighting like an army that hadn't been broken. They trusted that the enemy would yield to the initial pressure. The British knew that it wouldn't yield. They knew because they had learned when advancing meant drawing calculated fire, precise counterattacks, and losses that didn't appear in speeches. There was no mockery. There was silent comparison. The British observed how American units reacted when the plan failed, how they awaited orders at times when the decision already needed to be made. For an army shaped by defeat and survival, this did not indicate incompetence, it indicated immaturity. And in war, immaturity exacts its price. A British officer would awkwardly summarize this contrast years later. The Americans had everything England lacked in 1940, men, industry, reserves. What they still lacked was something no power can immediately provide: instinct under pressure, knowing when to move forward without permission, knowing when to retreat without collapsing, knowing that the plan dies early and that true command begins after that. This contrast redefined the relationship between the two armies. The British began to guide more, intervene more, insist more, not out of arrogance, but out of historical responsibility. They knew that this lesson would be learned anyway. The only unknown was the cost in lives. What is most revealing is that this trial never entered the official records. The reports spoke of adjustments, integration, and doctrinal differences. But among the British, the interpretation was different. This was the moment when decades of military tradition, built on both mistakes and victories, were showing their true value. Not as vanity, but as heritage. And it is this heritage that sustains this story. If you believe that the British approach, discreet, pragmatic, and shaped by bitter memory, deserves to be preserved and seriously discussed, leaving your thoughts in the comments is a way to keep this legacy alive. and if following these stories to the end make sense to you, subscribing isn't a gesture for the channel. It's a commitment to an English memory that never needed publicity to prove its worth. To understand what British soldiers truly thought when they saw the Americans retreating, it's necessary to understand what they carried with them even before witnessing that scene. It wasn't theory, nor newly written doctrine. It was accumulated memory. For many Britons, the war hadn't begun there. It had already been raging. For years marked by defeats that left no room for illusions. France, Belgium, Greece, Crete. Different places, the same lesson repeated by force. The enemy doesn't retreat because you advance with conviction. They retreat when forced. This experience created a specific type of soldier, no longer the man who waits for perfect orders or immaculate plans, but one who assumes something will go wrong and prepares for it. Among the British, the idea that the plan would survive first contact intact was seen almost as naivete. The plan existed to guide, not to be followed blindly. When the Americans advanced expecting initiative to solve the problem, the British saw it as an earlier stage of the same learning curve they themselves had traversed under live fire. The key difference lay in timing. The British had been forced to learn too early, when they were still poorly equipped, poorly positioned, and politically isolated. In 1940, there was no room for error. Every mistake cost men who would not be easily replaced. This pressure molded a hard, almost distrustful mentality. Advancing without cover was seen as wasteful. Persisting without support was seen as stubbornness. Experience had taught that isolated heroism rarely changed the outcome of a battle. When British soldiers observed the Americans, they didn't compare numbers or equipment. They compared reactions. What does a soldier do when the plan fails? Does he improvise or wait? Does he retreat in an organized manner or disband? Does he understand the sound of enemy artillery or simply react to it? These questions were automatic for those who had already survived unsuccessful campaigns. The American response at that initial moment did not yet meet these criteria. Among the British, there was an almost unsettling awareness that this experience could not be taught quickly. No manual, no accelerated course, no briefing could solve it. It was something that formed after seeing entire units surrounded for being overconfident, after losing friends for advancing a few meters beyond what the situation allowed. This type of knowledge does not generate enthusiasm. It generates caution, and British caution, often mistaken for pessimism, was in fact a product of survival. That is why the American retreat did not provoke scorn. It provoked recognition. The British saw it as a stage that needed to be overcome. They knew that this army had not yet been forced to face the worst-case scenario repeatedly. It had not yet internalized that war does not reward intention, but adaptation. For the British, this adaptation was already a reflex. For the Americans, it was still a learning process. This weight of experience also affected how the British positioned themselves morally. They didn't see themselves as superior. They saw themselves as scarred. The war had deprived them of the luxury of easy hope. Every advance was calculated based on what could go wrong, not on what they hoped would go right. This made their assessments colder, harsher, but also more accurate. Observing the Americans, many Britons knew that initial confidence wouldn't last long. Not because the Americans were incapable, but because war doesn't allow anyone to remain inexperienced for long. The question was never whether they would learn, but how much that learning would cost, and this silent calculation, made by men who had already buried too much, profoundly shaped the relationship between the two armies. The weight of British experience wasn't manifested in speeches or formal orders. It was manifested in glances, in short comments, in decisions made before the situation became irreversible. It was a type of authority that didn't need to be asserted. It simply existed, sustained by accumulated losses and a collective memory that refused to forget. This is the point that rarely appears in simplified narratives of the war. England did not enter that moment as a mentor out of arrogance, but out of scars. Every judgment made about the Americans was first subjected to an internal judgment. We've made mistakes like that before. And that is precisely why that initial observation, the first retreat, was not treated as a definitive failure, but as the inevitable beginning of a transformation that the British knew too well to ignore. There came a point when British observation ceased to be mere silent analysis and began to transform into real concern. Not because the Americans were failing catastrophically, but because it was becoming clear that the gap between expectation and reality had not yet been fully grasped by them. For the British, that was the most dangerous moment of any campaign, when an army believes it has understood war without yet having fully understood it. What the British perceived was not related to individual bravery, but to how the combat unfolded after the initial clash. When the situation deviated from the original plan, many Americans still sought confirmation, clear orders, an intact chain of command. For the British, this sounded like a fatal delay. They had already learned that war rarely offers time for validation. Either the decision is made at the right moment, or the moment simply passes. This was the true turning point. Not an isolated event, not a specific retreat, but the realization that the two armies were at different stages of the same learning process. The British saw war as an unstable system, in which any advance needed to anticipate the collapse of the initial plan. The Americans, on the other hand, still operated with the expectation that the plan, if well executed, would naturally lead to the desired outcome. For the British, this belief had already been shattered years before. The rupture also manifested itself in the way risk was assessed. British officers tended to assume that the enemy would always have a prepared response, even when there was no immediate evidence of it. This constant distrust was not paranoia, but institutionalized survival. The Americans, on the other hand, still tested limits. They advanced to see what happened. For the British, this was exactly the kind of decision that war punished without warning. As the days passed, it became evident that this difference could not be ignored. The British began to intervene more directly, not only in planning, but in pacing, positioning, and an almost bothersome insistence on coordination. It was not an attempt to take control, but to prevent known mistakes from being repeated. For those who had seen entire battalions lose their way due to overconfidence, tolerance for poorly calculated improvisations was minimal. This moment marked a subtle but profound shift in the relationship between the Allies. Until then, there had been a tacit expectation that the American presence would bring automatic solutions. From then on, the British began to see something different. An army in accelerated training, learning under pressure, making predictable mistakes, and yet demonstrating the ability to absorb lessons quickly. The rupture was not the end of trust, but the end of illusion. Internally, many Britons recognized that this shock was necessary. Without it, the Americans might have taken longer to abandon certainties. War does not allow for prolonged theoretical learning. It demands immediate answers to constantly changing problems. For the British, the rupture represented the moment when the Americans ceased to be merely a promising force and began, albeit painfully, to become an army shaped by reality. The most revealing aspect is that this turning point rarely appears clearly in official records. There is no report that says, "Here we perceived the difference." It remained restricted to the memory of those who were present, to comments made among experienced men, to the insistent corrections that began to be made before situations deteriorated. It was a type of informal leadership based not on hierarchical authority, but on accumulated memory. The rupture also had a profound psychological effect. For the British, it reinforced the notion that their experience, built over years of losses and forced adjustments, still had real strategic value. For the Americans, although not always immediately recognized, it was the beginning of abandoning a simplistic view of war. From then on, confidence would begin to be tempered by caution and initiative by coordination. This moment should not be read as a final judgment, but as an inevitable transition. Every army that goes to war needs to cross this point, where it realizes that reality does not conform to expectations. The British had crossed this line too early. The Americans were beginning to cross it now, and it was precisely at this instant, in this uncomfortable space between illusion and adaptation, that the relationship between the two armies began to transform definitively. What British soldiers actually said about the first American retreats doesn't appear in formal documents, archived reports, or later speeches about Allied unity. What survived were fragments, personal notes, never published letters, comments made between men who knew exactly what could and couldn't be said aloud during a war. It is in this informal space, far from rhetoric, that the British assessment becomes clearest. The British were acutely aware of the weight of words. After years of fighting virtually alone, they knew that any public judgment could be used politically or distorted. Therefore, their thoughts about the Americans remained confined to the inner circle of those who shared trenches, trucks, maps, and silences. And, within that circle, the tone was less emotional than many imagine. There were no insults. There were short, precise, almost clinical phrases. The most frequent comment didn't revolve around fear or lack of courage. It revolved around timing. They advance too early. They retreat too late. They wait for orders when the moment has already passed. These observations weren't moral accusations. They were tactical observations. For the British, the problem wasn't the individual soldier, but the collective reflex of an army still in formation under live fire. Many Britons made a clear distinction between visible behavior and invisible cause. The retreat in itself was not condemnable. What was worrying was the reason for the retreat. When it happened because the situation had been quickly assessed and corrected, it was seen as professionalism. When it happened because the plan had collapsed and no one knew exactly who should decide the next step, it was seen as a sign of operational immaturity. In personal letters, some Britons were surprisingly empathetic. They compared the Americans to themselves in 1940, still believing that discipline and bravery would compensate for structural flaws. This comparison wasn't made with nostalgia, but with discomfort. They knew exactly where that trajectory could lead if it wasn't corrected in time. The subtext of these observations was always the same. We've been there before. What almost never appears is any trace of cultural contempt. The British did not see the Americans as incapable nor naive by nature. What they saw was an army that had not yet been forced to abandon certainties. And for those who had already been stripped of those certainties by defeat, this difference was evident. It did not generate superiority, it generated urgency. These private conversations also reveal something important about the British mentality, a refusal to romanticize their own experience. When it was said that Americans had not yet learned certain lessons, the British did not treat these lessons as noble virtues. They treated them as scars. Each one was associated with mistakes made, bad decisions taken, men lost. There was no pride in having learned this way. There was only the awareness that not learning was worse. Therefore, many of the recorded phrases sound harsh but never triumphant. They still believe that war respects plans. They still expect clarity where there is only confusion. These are not the words of someone who feels superior, but of someone who recognizes an earlier stage of the same painful process. The British spoke like veterans who know that war does not forgive delays in learning. Another recurring point in these comments was the relationship with command. The British noted that many Americans still relied excessively on formal orders, even in fluid situations. For an army that had learned to operate under conditions of partial command collapse, this was a sign of risk, not because obeying was wrong, but because waiting too long could be fatal. This observation appeared repeatedly, always accompanied by the same implicit conclusion. This would change or had to change. Most significantly, these assessments were never used to claim historical protagonism after the war. The British did not publish memoirs saying, "We told you so." Many of these comments only surfaced decades later, when there was no longer any need to prove anything. This reinforces the idea that what was said at the time was not intended to construct a narrative. It was intended to understand the immediate reality. In the end, what the British really said about the Americans can be summed up in something simple and uncomfortable. They were still at the beginning of the path we had already traveled by force. This realization was not a verdict but a silent warning, a warning that shaped behaviors, corrections, and ultimately the way Allied cooperation evolved. These words didn't survive because they were kind or aggressive. They survived because they were honest. And it is in this raw honesty, far from official reports and versions, that one of the keys to understanding how Allies truly saw each other lies when no one was trying to write history. After the initial observations, something began to change, almost imperceptibly but decisively. The British stopped merely observing. The silent judgment gave way to a more active stance, even if never officially declared. It was not a decision made in a formal meeting, nor recorded in written orders. It was a gradual adjustment, born from the conviction that certain mistakes, if repeated, would be too costly to ignore in the name of good relations between allies. For the British, There was a clear line between respecting American autonomy and allowing already learned lessons to be relearned in the most cruel way possible. This line began to be crossed when it became evident that American learning, although rapid, was still bound by assumptions that the war had already shattered for England years before. From then on, British officers began to intervene more firmly, not as superiors but as veterans who refused to passively watch predictable mistakes. This intervention rarely took the form of direct command. It came in the form of insistent suggestions, corrections made before combat, and warnings that sounded almost uncomfortable due to their repetition. The British insisted on coordinated fire, on reserves positioned in advance, on alternative plans prepared even before the first move. To many Americans, this seemed like excessive caution. To the British, it was simply institutionalized survival. The central point of this shift was the realization that Americans still believed to some extent that initiative and energy would resolve situations that had already spiraled out of control. The British knew that this type of confidence usually lasts only until the first well-executed counterattack. Therefore, they began to push for more measured decisions, less dependent on impulse and more based on anticipating the worst-case scenario. This stance stemmed not from arrogance, but from responsibility. The British were fully aware that their experience was neither elegant nor heroic. It had been built on defeats, retreats, and mistakes that left deep scars. By intervening, they were not offering a manual for success, but a warning. War does not forgive delays in abandoning illusions. Each correction made to the Americans implicitly carried the weight of men who had already been lost for not making it sooner. Over time, this intervention began to take effect. The Americans started listening more, questioning certain recommendations less, and adjusting their pace. This didn't mean submission, but practical recognition. They realized that those warnings didn't come from theory, but from lived experiences. The relationship between the two armies then began to change. From an automatic expectation of material superiority, it shifted to a collaboration based on contrasting experiences. At the same time, the British were also adjusting their own perceptions. They began to notice something they hadn't fully anticipated: the speed with which the Americans absorbed lessons when finally confronted with reality. Where there had previously been doctrinal rigidity, adaptation began to emerge. Where there had been excessive waiting for orders, more calibrated initiative began to appear. This did not erase the initial errors, but it altered the British judgment of that army's potential. This process created a curious dynamic. The British, marked by years of losses, became more pragmatic and less forgiving. The Americans, confronted with their first limitations, became more receptive and less trusting. In the midst of this mutual adjustment, a form of cooperation was born that did not depend on public speeches or political declarations. It was based on something more fragile and more real: trust built under pressure. It is important to understand that this transition was not without friction. There was resistance, discomfort, and in some cases, resentment. No army likes to be reminded of its inexperience, especially one that came to war with enormous industrial and moral weight. But the British knew that the alternative, silence, would be worse. They themselves had suffered from a lack of clear warnings in the past. They did not intend to repeat that mistake as allies. Gradually, the focus shifted from the retreat itself to what came after it. The British watched closely to see if the Americans reorganized, corrected their actions, and learned from them. Every sign of adaptation was noted. Every repetition of an error was met with less patience. This change in attitude marks the true maturation of the relationship between the two armies, when criticism ceases to be implicit and becomes functional. Ultimately, the combination of these two moments, the silent judgment and the practical intervention, reveals something essential about the British mentality at that stage of the war. England was not seeking recognition nor symbolic leadership. It sought to avoid the waste of lives it already knew all too well. By intervening, the British were, in a way, trying to spare the Americans from repeating in full the path they themselves had been forced to take. This transition did not transform Americans overnight, nor did it erase tensions, but it created the conditions for something fundamental: accelerated learning, sustained by the bitter experience of an ally that could no longer afford to watch in silence. And it is at this point, when observation turns into action, that the relationship between the British and Americans ceases to be merely a formal alliance and begins to become a partnership shaped by the reality of war. While the British and Americans adjusted their relationship internally, there was a third observer watching every move: the enemy. For the Germans, the first American retreats were not interpreted in the same way many imagine. Far from being seen as definitive proof of incompetence, they were analyzed with professional detachment. The German command was accustomed to evaluating armies not by their initial mistake, but by the speed with which they corrected that mistake. And it was precisely there that something began to change. In the initial contacts, the German interpretation was predictable. Reports described American troops as numerous, well-equipped, but inexperienced. An army too large to be ignored, too young to be fully respected. This did not generate complacency, but rather confidence. For German officers accustomed to facing seasoned British forces, the Americans seemed to represent a medium-term problem, not an immediate threat. This assessment, however, had an expiration date. What began to bother the Germans was not the retreat itself, but what came after it. In subsequent confrontations, a change in behavior was noted. American units began to react more cautiously, to reposition artillery more methodically, and to avoid impulsive advances without adequate cover. For the Germans, this was a clear sign. The enemy was learning, and learning quickly. This type of adaptation was something the Germans deeply respected. German doctrine itself had been built on the idea of flexibility and rapid response to the battlefield. When they realized that the Americans were beginning to abandon doctrinal rigidity and initial overconfidence, the reports changed tone. There were still criticisms, there were still reservations, but there was no longer underestimation. Some German officers began to notice a clear difference between isolated Americans and Americans operating under British guidance. Where previously there had been predictable movements, more careful coordination was beginning to emerge. Where previously there had been unnecessary exposure, a more intelligent use of terrain and time was appearing. This evolution did not go unnoticed. To the enemy, it became clear that the alliance was beginning to function in a more integrated way. The crucial point for the Germans was realizing that the Americans were not merely correcting isolated errors, but adjusting their mindset. The war was ceasing to be seen as a sequence of decisive actions and was beginning to be treated as a process of attrition, anticipation, and continuous adaptation. This type of change does not happen without external pressure, and the Germans knew that this pressure came in large part from accumulated British experience. German accounts also record something unsettling: American resilience after setbacks. Unlike other armies that collapsed morally after an initial defeat, the Americans demonstrated the ability to absorb the impact, reorganize, and return to combat with visible adjustments. For an enemy accustomed to exploiting repeated failures, this represented a growing problem. Gradually, the American retreat ceased to be interpreted as a sign of structural weakness and began to be seen as part of a maturation process. And this altered the German calculations. An army that learns under fire is more dangerous than an army that is too confident to learn. This realization appears indirectly in later assessments, when the tone shifts from condescension to caution. What is most significant is that this shift in German perception occurred without propaganda, without announcements, without grand symbolic victories. It was built slowly, from small, observable adjustments on the battlefield. For the Germans, this was the most worrying type of evolution: silent, practical, and sustained by genuine cooperation between allies. In this sense, the German perspective ends up functioning as an indirect external validation of the initial British assessment. What the British had identified as correctable inexperience began to be confirmed in the eyes of the enemy. The retreat, which seemed a sign of weakness, revealed itself to be only the first stage of a process that, if it continued, would make that army increasingly difficult to confront. At some point, almost impossible to date precisely, the British soldiers realized that something had definitively changed. It wasn't announced. It wasn't celebrated. It wasn't recorded in reports as an official turning point, but it became clear to anyone watching closely. The Americans no longer reacted as before. The initial retreat, which had served as a marker of inexperience, ceased to be the standard by which they were judged. In its place, something more difficult to measure began to emerge: consistency under pressure. The British began to notice that the Americans no longer advanced with the same disorganized haste, nor retreated with the same rigidity dependent on formal orders. There were visible adjustments. Decisions were being made earlier. Movements were less impulsive. There was a more judicious use of support and reserves. For an army accustomed to quickly identifying patterns, this was an unmistakable sign of maturity. This recognition was not accompanied by explicit praise. British military culture rarely functioned that way. Respect was shown indirectly, almost austerely. It appeared when warnings diminished, when intervention became less frequent, when silence returned. Not the silence of distrust, but that of operational confidence. When the British stopped correcting every American move, it was because they no longer felt the need. The most significant aspect is that this change wasn't driven by a single victory or a spectacular feat. It was built through accumulation. Battle after battle, the Americans began to demonstrate something the British valued above all else: the ability to learn without needing to repeat mistakes many times. Where there had once been persistence, now there was adaptation. Where there had once been naive expectation, now there was calculation. For the British, this profoundly altered the internal tone of the assessment. They no longer spoke of an army in training, but of an ally in consolidation. The difference is subtle but crucial. An army in training still requires constant vigilance. An army in consolidation begins to share real responsibilities. And it was at this moment that the British began to entrust the Americans with more complex, less supervised, and more decisive tasks. This process also had a significant psychological impact. For British soldiers scarred by years of losses, seeing an ally learn so quickly had an ambiguous effect. On the one hand, relief. The burden no longer needed to be carried alone. On the other, a silent realization. What had cost them dearly was now being absorbed by others at an accelerated pace. There was no envy in this, but there was historical awareness. British respect was also evident in the way Americans were mentioned in internal conversations. References ceased to be comparative and became functional. It was no longer said, "They still don't understand this, but they will deal with that." This kind of shift in language is revealing. It indicates that doubt no longer occupies the center of the evaluation. It has been replaced by operational expectation. It is important to understand that this respect did not erase past mistakes, nor did it rewrite the past. The British did not forget the initial setbacks, but they came to see them as part of a complete trajectory, not as a permanent definition. This distinction is essential. For those who know war firsthand, the initial mistake does not disqualify. It is the inability to learn that condemns, and on that point, the Americans had crossed the critical line. This moment also marked a shift in how the British viewed the future of the war. With an ally that no longer needed constant guidance, it became possible to envision more ambitious operations, deeper coordination, and a real division of responsibilities. Respect, in this context, was not emotional. It was strategic. As the war progressed and the first American retreats faded, almost no one bothered to officially record what had been thought, said, or assessed during that uncomfortable beginning. There were no minutes, no communiques, no public corrections to the narrative. And that is precisely where the silent legacy of this episode lies. It survived not as official history, but as professional memory among soldiers who knew how to distinguish propaganda from reality. For the British, that initial moment was not remembered as an American weakness, but as a turning point, a moment when England's accumulated experience, built on defeats, improvisation, and survival, finally found an ally willing to learn quickly. British pride did not stem from having been right, but from having carried enough hard-won knowledge to prevent others from repeating the same path to the end. This legacy isn't manifested in grandiose monuments or commemorative speeches. It appears in smaller details, in the way joint operations came to be planned, in the growing confidence in American decisions, in the gradual reduction of the need for British intervention. When the British stopped correcting, it was because they recognized competence, and, for an army shaped by caution, that is a rare and profound form of respect. There is also a moral aspect to this legacy. The British never publicly claimed the role of tutors. They did not transform their experience into political capital after the war. Many of those who observed the early setbacks took their impressions to the grave without ever publishing them. This was not casual modesty. It was consistency with a military culture that valued duty fulfilled above public recognition. Over time, the dominant East narrative of the war has oversimplified this relationship. Films, popular books, and political speeches have transformed the alliance into something almost automatic, erasing the friction, the adjustments, and the painful lessons. The silent British legacy is precisely the opposite of this simplification. It reminds us that real alliances are built under tension and that true respect is not born from slogans, but from repeated behavior under extreme pressure. For England, there is a particular pride in this legacy, a pride that doesn't shout, doesn't show off, and doesn't demand constant external validation. It's the pride of knowing that when war demanded maturity, England already possessed it, even if that maturity had been acquired too early and at too high a cost. And more importantly, it knew how to share it without turning it into a spectacle. This episode also leaves a lasting lesson about how history should be told, not as a sequence of flawless heroes, but as a human process, full of initial mistakes, difficult corrections, and forced growth. The first American retreat, observed with British attention, diminishes no one. It humanizes the war and restores complexity to a narrative that has often been flattened for convenience. Today, what remains are fragments, diaries, letters, comments preserved by chance, small records that don't change maps, but change understanding. They show that England, even exhausted, even marked by losses, still had something essential to offer, experience transformed into discernment. This is the kind of legacy that rarely receives credit, but that sustains victories long after the last shot is fired. If there is one possible conclusion, it is this. The British valor at that moment lay not in preventing others' mistakes, but in recognizing the error without contempt, intervening without humiliation, and retreating into silence when the ally was already prepared. This stance is not reflected in medals, but it is reflected in results. And if this kind of legacy, discreet, firm, and profoundly English, makes sense to you, it's worth recording, not for easy applause, but for reflection. In the comments, these stories gain continuity. By following this work, you help ensure that the British contribution is not reduced to a footnote or cliché, but remembered with the complexity and dignity it truly deserves. What began as a silently observed retreat ended as a learning experience that redefined the very war between the Allies. In the next chapter, the question ceases to be, "With Americans learned?" and it becomes how far this transformation led to conflict. If this interpretation of British pride, firm and unassuming, resonates with you, write resilience in the comments. And if this kind of story deserves to continue to live on, liking and subscribing is a simple way to ensure it continues to be told with the seriousness it deserves.